There he is.
I
Hi.
made it. I made it.
Good. How are you, Matt?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad that we're not in a, terrible storm this week.
That
We had
was, yes. So far, so good, right?
a problem last week because we were so concerned we weren't going to have a good connection, but all is well. All is well. How are you? Tell me how you're doing with the world today, right now. Just give me a summary.
Well, the world feels better than it did. Um, I worry. I continue to worry. I worry about, I worry about COVID. I worry about people's patience to continue to be as wise as possible, knowing that there's a vaccine on the horizon. I think that there's a dark winter ahead, and I just hope that we're braced for it. Um, Grateful for the election results as they come in day by day, but really worried about what's happening out in the streets and what might be before us between now and January 20th in this country. But feeling better day by day.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's where I'm at as well. Sort of the light is at the end of the tunnel, at least, it feels like. Um
Yes.
so yeah, first of all, just thank you so much for jumping on tonight and being a part of this conversation. We had a good catch-up call with you along with my friend Latife Karimi, where we just kind of discussed a little bit about where you're at on the topic of discussing systemic racism and a little bit about your career. And for everyone that's tuning in tonight, it'd be really great if you could give us a little bit of a little bit of background of how you got, interested in this field of study, and then what led you to write. Let's be honest, one of the first books on whiteness as a construct. Yeah, just tell us a little bit about that journey because it is,
Sure.
yeah, it's worth something.
Yeah, well, okay, thank you. So, it starts as a very personal journey. I grew up in the 1960s, and even though I grew up in a very, very white neighborhood in a very white town, I grew up in a liberal household, and so the civil rights movement was very much kind of on the news every night and around the kitchen table conversation. So I kind of grew up with this sense of the importance of race in this country, and honestly, with a real sense that where there were heroes to be found on the American scene, most of them were people who were engaged in social justice issues around race. That was just like, that's how I grew up. I brought that to college with me and studied not so much race per se at the beginning, but I was interested in immigration. I was interested in kind of, I was one of the generation who was reared with the kind of roots trip and the kind of ethnic revival. So family history, my own family came in part from Russia. And that was really my introduction to history as a pursuit. And then early in my career, writing about European immigrant groups, I started tripping over in the sources. I was just tripping over these weird racial usages, especially in the 19th century, but even into the turn of the 20th. Um, Racial groups that just we don't think of anymore. So, like Hebrews as a race, or Celts as a race, or Slavs as a race. And at the time when I was in graduate school, I think historians just, whenever they saw that kind of language, they thought, oh, they really mean ethnicity. They don't really mean race.
Mm.
And I just started asking, well, what if they did? Like, what if we start assuming then that what we're seeing is not an archaic usage of the word race, but an archaic understanding of who the races are. And that led to a whole career in studying whiteness and race in general and politics. And so the book that came out of that initial set of questions is called Whiteness of a Different Color, and it's a book that takes the European immigrant groups, the groups who become Caucasian in the 20th century, but it traces their trajectory through these different vicissitudes of racial identity and ascription,
Yeah.
not for its own sake, but as a way of understanding how race operates in the American setting. What does it mean? What's at stake? What's at stake in being a Celt versus being a Caucasian, and what are the processes that have to take place for that change to happen? That was a book that was written back in the 90s. And then since then, I've traveled around a lot. I've written about the white ethnic revival. I've written about race and popular culture. I've written about the civil rights era. I've worked on a film about the desegregation of baseball. So I've kind of been around a lot, but all of my work is around issues of race and politics and culture in the United States.
When did you become first aware of your own racial context, as someone who, like you said, grew up in the 60s and around this influence? Because I can think of the moments when I was first come to terms with that in New Zealand and understanding why, the idea that this whiteness had an idea of sort of normality and everything was othered. But I always find it interesting to sort of dissect that a little bit, and it can be personal and hard to understand when those moments happen for all of us. But a big part of the sobriety journey, isn't it, of opening our eyes to things. Was there
Right.
a moment for you like that, or did it come in college and you got more interested?
I could point to a few different, I mean, I think it happened in stages for me. And I think um, like so many white people in this country, I mean, one of the ways that white privilege functions is it gives you the privilege of being totally ignorant and naive. Like you don't have to think about race. And in fact, race remains invisible to you in all kinds of ways that are truly just, well, myopic, but also kind of the luxury of the privilege that you hold. So I would say that my consciousness came to me in stages. I could point to particular moments. I think that, well, I remember my father when I was really young, and my father was a pretty committed, good old fashioned white liberal, and he a Jewish liberal from New York, and he was trying to explain to me the philosophical logic of nonviolence. This must have been probably in about 1966 or 65. I was pretty young. I was probably like 7 or 8, and I totally didn't get it at all. But he was trying to school me in the philosophy behind the civil rights struggle. And I remember being really struck by it. And I remember like paying a certain kind of attention to the civil rights movement through those years, even though I was quite young. One of my personal heroes as a kid was a baseball player named Dick Allen, who was an African American. He played for the Phillies and then the Cardinals. And um, on a family summer vacation once, we got to our paths crossed, hit the Cardinals at a day game in San Diego. I was probably around 11, and I remember shouting. I was standing by the dugout hoping for an autograph, and I shouted out to Dick Allen, and to no avail. He totally ignored me for reasons that I understand now. But I think that was the first time I'd actually addressed an African American person. And in retrospect, I think that I must have been at some level very keenly aware of my own whiteness in a way that I probably wasn't when I was, just in my normal social orbit in Boulder, Colorado. Um, but I think the kind of the lights going on happened much later for me. It happened in college. It happened through study. It happened through, a widening horizon of more kind of cosmopolitan engagements with different kinds of people and just learning, and learning about difference through friendships, really. And then on to grad school as an object of study.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I feel like we touched on this in our last chat, but going into studying whiteness as a construct seems like such an important part of this work. When we talk about systemic racism, we can talk about the Black experience, the Brown experience, and understand that. And of course, that's a big part of the conversation. We need to understand how we got here with whiteness, which is, the field of study that you're in, it seems. But we talked a little bit about how difficult it can be and how many risks there are involved with spearheading the conversation around whiteness, because there is such a tendency, because we can be blind sometimes to how what's the word, how easy it is for us to be ignorant of our own race. And so sometimes when we're engaging in these topics, there is a risk that one might set
Mhm.
themselves in the conversation, kind of do a full circle where we're trying to zoom out, but in turn
Mhm.
we forget that actually we've zoomed back in on, and mentioned this in regard to rise of books on white privilege and whiteness.
Mhm.
I'd love to just chat with you a little bit about that, because directly from that world of having authored books on this topic. And sometimes you don't think about the risks that are, it's not just enough to have these great intentions, I guess is what I say, and on that. Yeah.
That's absolutely the key. I mean, I think that a lot of white people, and I mean, including really smart and well-intentioned and good-hearted people, think that their good intentions are enough, or that their good intentions are the most important thing. Um, Good intentions are not nothing, but they are not enough. And I think that, you know, white people in these conversations have a tendency to take things very personally and to get very defensive and to think that they're under personal attack if the subject of white supremacy or white privilege is the subject. And I think that we just have to get beyond that. We have to, I mean, we have to have the courage to really look at it. That's one thing. But I don't think we have to take it personally. I think that we can take a step back. This is the advantage of being a historian, I suppose, is to think in a really broad strokes about huge swaths of the society over huge swaths of historical time, and to think about whiteness itself not so much as a personal identity as it is a kind of social structure. It's a structure that we inhabit. It's a legal structure. It's a political structure. It's a juridical structure. It's a structure that's been it's been built and maintained and policed over time, and it's a structure that we inhabit, you know, with or without our permission. But it's a structure that allows us. Privilege is one way of looking at it. There's a social scientist who uses the word immunity, and I like that construction. That if you're white, you know, you are immune from really having to worry about getting shot in a routine traffic stop. If you're white, you're immune from being followed around in a drugstore or having your hair products under lock and key at the Walmart. Or, you know, there are just 1,000 things, big and small, that you're immune to or immune from if you're white. And I think that those are the kinds of things. That's where we need to start in the conversation. Not you know, not personally defending ourselves as good people, but really interrogating the structures that we inhabit, and then giving name to and doing a kind of inventory for ourselves of how our own whiteness has positioned us in life. And that's a deep story, and it can be across many generations for some of us, depending on our family stories. But I think that's a better place to start than with the much more personal story of my own good intentions. And I'm not a racist, so therefore, like, you know, why do I have to think about this stuff?
Yeah, of course. How have you, because, you know, when Atufe and I thought about having various guests on, we realized that when we do invite those who are white to come and speak, it's important that we uh, have observed them doing the work as a person to be anti-racist, because I know it's important that we didn't bring on any white folk to talk about things, because we want to be really careful that we're always driving information and education. And that's why someone like yourself, you know, not to put you on a grand pedestal, but to say that you have given your life to really try to unpack and understand it. So I feel really confident to help guide me through this process of my own around race and my understanding of immunity, and that's a helpful word. Thank you for that. But what are some? I'm trying to. I mean, I don't want to be like, what are some tips? But you know, how kind of navigated? What have been the most important ways for you to remain humble through the process as you have to, you know, not only teach on the topic, but also be deconstructing your own you know, journey with this stuff? Are there, it seems like humility is a big one, right? Being always walking, understanding that, you know, we are here to learn, and these are experiences that we can never fully understand firsthand. But what are some other things for people to feel,
Yeah.
you know?
I mean, I do think it starts with self-knowledge. So I think it's, you know, what I was just saying about kind of doing an inventory of your life and figuring out the ways that race has mattered, because we are raised, if we're white, most often to think a couple of things. To think that we deserve what we have, to think that if we're not racists, we're not implicated in this really complex history in this country, that we're absolved. for those of us who come from some kind of Ellis Island experience of a family history that runs, you know, generations after some kind of steerage experience from Europe, we're encouraged, I think, we're taught to think that slavery was a long time ago and it has nothing to do with us. We're fresh off the boat, had nothing to do with it. We're innocent. We're innocent, and that's part of whiteness, is its power to reconstruct its own innocence again and again. So I think that doing that inventory and just understanding your own history and how it has deposited you in a place where you are, and how race has everything to do with that. You know, I think I remember in our first conversation, I said to study race in the United States is to exclude nothing, right? If you're studying race in the United States, you're studying every single thing. You're studying popular culture, you're studying political economy, you're studying hiring practices and banking practices and politics and land. I mean, there's nothing that is out of your purview. So I think understanding your own white life in those terms is really, it's illuminating, but it's also, it's the most important starting point to see that, oh yeah, you know, my grandfather was part of a Jim Crow industry, and that actually has a lot to do with what he was able to accomplish after he got off the boat, you know, and was in New York. And he, you know, he was able to send his children to college based on money that was kind of ill-gotten gain of the real estate practices in a totally racist real estate market. And his son, my father, was able to send me to college because of benefits from the GI Bill that were completely keyed to the status he had as a white officer in the military during the Korean War. I mean, and you start really doing the inventory, and there's you know, the loans and the mortgages and where the money came from to put me through college, and you know, how I have parlayed that in, you know, in a landscape that where whiteness just, it matters, and it can be parlayed in 1,000 ways. So once you kind of recognize truly how race has figured in your own life, that's kind of a step one to being able to reckon with it in a real way. And then it becomes more possible to have a frank discussion and to not be as defensive about it, but to be more understanding. And also to understand that, that as white people, because we have the privilege of our ignorance, we have an awful lot to learn. And we cannot presume that we're the arbiters of everything. Like if a person of color is telling us a certain thing is racist, we best listen to that, you know. But I think it's one of the reflexes of whiteness is to take control of the power to define. It's like, if I don't think it's racist, then it's not racist. You know, I have a friend, another of the whiteness studies people, Dave Roediger, has this great line. I just think it's so smart. He said, white bigotry is down, self-reported. So I think white people, you know, so white people say that they're not racist, so therefore white people assume that bigotry is less of a problem than it was a generation ago.
Yeah.
You know, you ask people of color and you're going to get a very different answer. So, I mean, what I'm saying is white people need to learn to really listen. And this is where, you know, the debates over microaggression, and there's a whole kind of post-civil rights language for it. But I think that those discussions are often stymied or stilted because on the white side of the color line, there's not a true engagement with it. There's a kind of reflexive defensiveness about it. You know, so if I always think that if everybody knew, you know, the history of redlining and racist housing policies, if everybody knew that and had access to that knowledge, then we could have a very different public discussion about, you know, wealth and the wealth gap and inequities of all sorts. So it really does start with the kind of self-knowledge and the historical knowledge for me.
Sounds like what you're saying, that historical background actually helps one to not, I don't want to say depersonalize, because I feel like that's writing off in some way, but there does need to be some process of distancing, or not. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, as you put, when one is so overly identified with their whiteness as being their sort of identity and their innocence, or there's sort of, you're so closely identified with it that leads to that defensiveness. Whereas if you can see yourself in a larger context, or use the word like my skin color experience, then there's a distance created there that again doesn't run ability. I still have to own up to where
Right.
being racist at times, had microaggressions, but it creates a perspective where we don't have to take everything so like, oh, you're calling me a person.
Right. Right. To talk about white supremacism is not to lodge an accusation necessarily. I mean, we should hear the, and think about the possibilities there, but it
Mm,
doesn't have to be experienced as a very personalized accusation. It's more of a kind of a broad sociological or historical observation of something that is true and something that really requires investigation, and requires some honesty and some, I mean, ultimately, I think it requires some kind of truth and reconciliation, but we're a long way from that.
wow, that's exactly how I feel. I've been really inspired by the movement of that in South Africa, places that have been able to successfully. Yeah, I I also think about how we could get there, and I guess this is a drop in the ocean in terms of the work that needs to be done. But I do believe that conversations are going to be the springboard to real, and being able to have conversations means letting down our guard. And as one of my guests, early guests said, it's important to be engaging with people in your community who are living a different skin color experience, but it's also very important to be engaging with those who are white amongst
Hmm.
whites, because we
Hmm.
are, for better for
Right.
worse, who can really make this difference and be somewhat held responsible, yes, for the situation we're in now. So I'm really excited that we're getting to have this conversation, because for me there's a missed opportunity there.
Hmm.
They're only across skin color lines, rather than us looking
Right.
face to face at what we can do when we have so much power in the world. uh,
That is, yes, no, exactly. And there's anti-racist work to be done virtually everywhere. In your industry, in my industry, in our neighborhoods, on the street, when you are a witness to an encounter, whether, whatever it is, there's anti-racist work to be done virtually everywhere around us, and there's all kinds of work to be done. So it's not as though there's a one prescription for all white people, like here's what you must do or here's what you should do. It's more like let's know ourselves well enough to know what we're capable of, and to know what we have it in us to do on this subject, and to really take it on and to really do it. And I think that's been one of the failures, I think, of white liberals in particular, but white people more generally, I think, is that there's been a failure to really take it on as our burden and our struggle. And I think that, and you see it again and again, where racism becomes a problem that people of color are supposed to solve because it's their problem, and it's not their problem. I mean, it's our problem, but we make it their problem. And it really has to be approached that way. I mean, white people have to understand that this is a burden that we must take on, and this is work for us to do. And we've rejected it time and time again. And you can point to so many points. I mean, you could go back, and there've been heroic moments too. I don't want to. I mean, there are a lot of, in studying racism, I should say. I mean, the thing that gets you through the day, studying what is a very difficult and very ugly history, is that there are thousands of really inspiring moments and figures and heroes, and and templates for action. So we have a lot of resources for this work. Um, but in a general way, we have yet to truly take it on. And I think that that's one of the encouraging things, about what we've seen just in the last several months, since the Breonna Taylor and George Floyd murders, that you do see. And I don't want to be overly, I don't want to be a Pollyanna about it, but I think that we're seeing an engagement of white people in this issue that is something different from what we've seen. And it's just, I mean, it's staggering. I mean, you think about it. I mean, Joe Biden, in his acceptance speech, he actually used the phrase systemic racism. And I don't think a president-elect has ever used that language. So I think we're kind of getting somewhere, or at least we have an opportunity in 2020 and going forward that is slightly different from more the years before.
One of the guests that I had on previously talked about this idea of how there's been a sort of brainwash white folk, especially lower class, to believe that they have more in common with someone like Trump, for example, or another white person who has, a ton of money, than they do their are in the same class but are racially different to them. And that seems like a real problem because, there's such a missed opportunity there, which is, of course, that the poor in America who are all, struggling to get by, have seen their kids all dealing with the same thing. There could be such a movement there of like, hey, we're all getting screwed over by the system. This is a class, movement. And that's where I actually think hip hop and a lot of music can be really inspiring in that sense of like, just the artists that have been in connection to their roots and the neighborhood they come from and create rise up with but it's just you made me think about that when you said that we as white folk haven't really taken this on as our in the same way that those of color have had to, because there's no that's the thing, you can't choose to be black one day and choose to, whereas we get to dip our toes in and out of these protests.
Mm-hmm.
Find that really
Mm-hmm.
problematic. Whereas if we were to see it as our, binding together perhaps over class or over not convincing ourselves that we have in common with white men
Right.
than we do with our fellow neighbor who happens to have a different skin color. Is that making sense?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois, I mean, one of the great theorists of race globally, but especially in the U.S. I mean, he called it the psychological wage of whiteness. So that a white person who might be oppressed in 1,000 different ways, and might, if he or she really investigated it and thought about it, might find common cause with African Americans, and for Du Bois, the recently emancipated African Americans, immigrants, Chinese migrants. They might find all kind of common cause with those folks, but instead they accept the psychological wage of whiteness, which is like the payoff for being able to feel and be superior socially in a certain way. That's and to take that wage, the psychological wage, instead of anything that is like true equity. And the costs of that are just enormous. And I think we see that. I mean, I think our history is built on that. But I think in the post-civil rights years, like that is what American politics is made of, is this really cruel and kind of ignorant bargain that has been made. I mean, there's a great. You should have her as a guest, actually. Heather McGhee is just a wonderful thinker and writer. She was the president of Demos for a while. But the metaphor she uses is the draining of the public swimming pool in the desegregation era, where town after town after town across the South, when the judicial orders came down that they had to desegregate public accommodations, including swimming pools, rather than do that, they drained the pool so that nobody had a swimming pool. Rather than share it with black people, the local white people drained the swimming pool. And I think that is a really powerful metaphor. And again, I want to credit Heather McGhee with this thinking, but it's a really powerful metaphor for how that psychological wage has functioned over the decades since the civil rights victories in the 1960s. That again and again we see instances where white voters, white publics, white workers have really kind of cut off their nose to spite their face when it comes to accepting that psychological wage of whiteness and the status that goes with it, instead of really thinking through what equitable governance might look like, what true social equality might look like, and how they might benefit from it. Racism is actually quite costly to a lot of white people in certain ways, but whiteness itself and our approaches to it tend to get in our way of seeing that sometimes.
Yeah, that's super helpful. We talked a little bit about the process of desegregation, which you brought up on our last call. I'm still very much in it across all.
Mm-hmm.
Even our last guest, Jake King, mentioned that the music industry and the contracts that are drawn up for artists or whatever, it's still kind of based off of like a colonial kind of construct. So there's a lot of desegregation to be done there around ownership. And he also brought up the language of inclusion. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. I mean, this is the struggle that university communities everywhere are dealing with right now, because I think that like corporations, actually, university administrations have adopted this language of belonging and inclusion, which I would argue is corrupted in a couple of different ways. One, it's corrupted because it's divorced from the actual kind of social justice struggles that produced this kind of thinking in the first place, right? Like the civil rights movement was fighting for equality, and corporate America has turned that into inclusion, which is not equality and it's not equity. It's its own thing. So that's one way that the language of inclusion can be corrupted, is that it's defanged. All the kind of social and social justice teeth are taken out of it. But the other thing, and this is subtler, but maybe even more important, is that and this is just a real problem in universities, and I'm going to go ahead and guess that it is in a lot of industries, that if I'm promising to include you, I'm still taking the territory as my own, right? I'm gonna welcome you in, but the house is still mine. And I think that is it's a problematic way of approaching the problem in the first place, and there's momentum against its own stated goals, actually, just in the formulation of the problem, right? If I'm going to include you, but in including you, I'm going to continue to mark all the territory as my own, we're never going to get there. So we need a different language. We need a sharper language, and we need to think more. We need to get back more to the kind of social justice and equity thinking that really gave birth to diversity consciousness in the first place. So I like the language of desegregation because it does more of that work, but it's more honest. I think that we've told ourselves some really kind of self-flattering stories about how much progress we've made in the last number of decades, and that's kind of where inclusion comes from. It's like we've almost got it licked, right? We almost have the problem solved. We just need to let in a few more people. But I think that our society is still so segregated in so many ways that desegregation is still what we're about, even though we teach ourselves to think that desegregation happened in 1954. But meanwhile, we live in segregated neighborhoods. We go to segregated schools. Just every layer of our lives are segregated. And in colleges, what this means is a lot of, college students, no matter where they came from, whether they're African Americans from New York or white kids from rural Idaho, whoever they are, the chances are pretty good that this college setting is the first truly integrated setting they've ever been in. And thinking of it in those terms is very different from kind of thinking of it in the easier way of like inclusion and belonging. Like we're still in the midst of a desegregation project, and we need to take it on at that level of seriousness and thoughtfulness and dedication and devotion.
Yeah, that's really great. You work of integration, your classes of and what you're getting to be a part of people as they unpack race and explore that, because that seems like a very nuanced thing to observe in oneself. It's like playing into the inclusion game of like, some friends who are, I include this in my world, versus this space is shared and I'm aware of the that I take up, context willing to take a step back in order to elevate those who, how that seems like a really nuanced and like, God, mind, it requires a lot of focus to really see the difference between the two. I feel like you might have had some good opportunities to observe what those two look like in your work and how, what to watch out for, I guess, as
Right.
well.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And in the classroom, I mean, it's so challenging, but it is, it is one of those things where experience matters. And because we live in such a segregated society, a lot of people don't have a ton of experience really dealing in truly kind of diverse integrated spaces. So it's been a journey in the classroom for me, but I've learned so much. And um, I guess maybe the most important thing to learn is what you have yet to learn, and being really keen to that, and being open to that, and understanding, even if you're the professor or the boss or whatever, if you're at the top of the hierarchy in the room, that doesn't mean that you're the authority on every question. And you need to know kind of where your own authority is, and you need to help other people see that in themselves as well, and to understand, um, what are the things they can speak to, and on what basis, and what are the things that they best just sit back and listen for a while, and to really create a space that feels safe, but also feels totally serious, and dedicated to the enterprise of really interrogating what is going to be some difficult, substance, but working together to really get our heads around it, and to think it through together, but each with a different contribution to make.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. This is making me think now, going off on a little tangent, but I'm just going to follow it. I think a lot of people are scared, Matt, to engage on these issues if they feel like they don't know a lot about it. And I'll, speak personally from as like a kid coming from New Zealand, living in America for this time, and you know, slowly but surely coming to see that a lot of what I have, based off hard work, but very much off a lot of privilege that I have, and probably, developing the courage to speak out about the things that I care about, and but being pretty nervous in the process to do that, and also pretty aware that I'm pretty shaky on a lot of the, and I can be better at that, and but I do want to speak for anyone who's like listening into these conversations, feels like, because this is where passivity comes from, and I'm guilty of it as
Hmm.
well. Like, for a long time, I had this attitude of like, well, I'm here, so I'm not really fight. This is really problematic when a white New Zealander, for example, steps out of the because they weren't, because my skin color experience means that I play into all of these dynamics still and receive a lot of the benefits of it. But what I'm trying to work out what my question is, but I'm trying to ask, what would you say to someone who perhaps feels that they are so far from where like yourself is, Dorian, who's equipped with the information, the background, the history, what a canon of experience to be able to put on the table. And for those who are just starting on their journey, how can they feel like they have something, even as a white person or a person of color, so that we don't get people on the sideline that are
Yeah.
because they're too scared to be wrong or to say.
Right. Well, yeah, no, I think that's one of the biggest problems. That's maybe it isn't one of the biggest problems. We have so many problems, um, but it is a huge problem that people. Let's just stay with white people. White people would rather stay safe than take the risk of being criticized. But what they have to understand is that their safety is somebody else's danger. And that in staying safe, you are actually creating hazards. You're participating in the creation of hazards if you are, if you're so scared to think it through, and to address the issue, and to ask questions, and to engage. If you're that afraid of it, just think about how fearful other people in this society must be. And that's when you study history, of this country, that's where you end up, is like, oh my God, and white people are afraid. White people are the ones who are scared. Are you kidding me? It's like, African
Well,
Americans are.
The
that
privilege.
like there's so much danger. There's so much danger out there in so many different ways, and white people are afraid. So I think that understanding your own safety is coming at a cost is like maybe the first step to overcoming it, and to realizing that you know, you got to take it on as your burden, and you have to find a way to do it. And you know, if courage is not being required of you, then you're probably not taking on enough.
Thank you for that. That's powerful. Yeah, what a privilege to feel uncomfortable
Well, that's
talking
right.
about.
No, and that's it's absolutely crucial.
Yeah, I mean that's some people aren't even. Yeah, it's a privilege to be able to tap in and out and feel comfortable versus uncomfortable. Some that's not even talking
Right, or
about.
to think of it, or to think of it as optional. Like, you know, race is optional. I don't have to think about it. I can if I want, but I don't have to.
Yes.
Yes, but it's not optional for everybody, and we really have to understand that.
Yeah. We ask a couple of questions every time we do Down the Rabbit Hole with a guest. Feel they are important for not only like understanding where we're at, but maybe ways that we can start to take more action. So I wanted to ask you if there was sort of one thing at this time that you, white folk especially, were talking about among each other. What would that be?
I'm sorry, you just cut out for
That's
just I
okay.
missed
Yeah,
like the crucial words of the question. I couldn't
the
hear.
moment. Yeah. So if if there was one or two main things that you wish white folk were talking about amongst each other, what would that be?
Mm. Yeah, I think that beginning with a self-understanding and then turning it into a kind of collective mutual understanding among white people about how whiteness has really figured. Like, you know, if you ask most people to narrate their autobiography, most people, like 99% or even more, will narrate their entire life story without reference to race. But then, and I've done this in workshops, then if you ask them to retell the story, but to take up the question of race everywhere where they can possibly imagine that it's relevant, they tell a very different story, you
Ah,
know. And I think that's an important thing, like that recognition. And when you see the lights go on that way and people realize, oh, you know, it actually matters that I grew up in an all-white neighborhood, and it matters not only in my experience, but it matters in how wealth accrued to our family house because it was a segregated space in, you know, in a real estate market that prizes white homogeneity, and that, you know, property values hold in a particular way that they don't in other parts of town, you know.
well,
So like at recognition at that level of how race figures in your own story, but then sharing that knowledge and just making it part of a common understanding about how race operates, so that it is no longer merely or simply the burden of people of color to carry all of that knowledge and to carry that, you know, that level of analysis and the commitment to interpretation and rethinking. I mean, white people have to get more engaged with that. So that's one thing.
inventory. I mean, that's the word that you personal inventory. Then perhaps
Yeah, no, that comes, you know, the great Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci says that history has deposited you in a place that's not of your own making, and without an inventory. And I think that is like really significant. It's significant intellectual work that we all need to do. It's significant political and social work that we all need to do. Is to do that inventory, to figure it out. Like, what, you know, what are the things that history has done to put me where I am, and then the next part is, what do I want to do with that?
right.
You know,
Yep.
what's my intervention going to be?
What's my contribution to it? Yeah. Know my context and what can I contribute or what can I bring? It's also just makes me think of like, it's like kind of being cute for a lot of white folks, 23 and Me, and know where you and the sort of, but what would it look like to also, for those of us who are lucky enough to be able to trace our ancestors, you know, to also see that, yeah, like me having, I don't know, I found out it's Italian or something, but looking, okay, well, what is
Yeah,
that?
no, that's yeah, no, and actually, and it's you know, and I referenced before, I grew up during the ethnic revival, where suddenly, like, everybody, you know, my grandfather spoke Yiddish. He made damn sure that my father never learned to speak Yiddish. And then I was that generation who went and studied Yiddish because I wanted to recover everything that my father's generation had lost, right? And there is this sense in which, from that was in the 70s, but from that point onward, when white people study history, it's often for some kind of romantic thing that they're after, a romantic self-conception of, like, some romantic past in some, shtetl or ghetto somewhere that's going to kind of give them a better feeling about who they are in the world.
Uh-huh.
But I would say, and that's actually been important to me, and it can lead you to all kinds of broader questions. But I would say skip over that if you can and go to the broader questions. And there are other things about history that are going to be more important for you to know than some romantic version of, like, who your grandparents were.
Yeah, no, that's super true. Now I know that the music
Going to be more important for you to know that lead you to all kinds of broader questions. But I would say skip over that if you can and go to the broader questions. And there are other things about history that are going to be more important for you to know than some romantic version of, like, who your grandparents were.
Yeah, no, that's super true. Now I know that the music industry isn't, where you reside, but it is another system that is very much like, I'm sure, the education system, and like you said, politics, and like, we don't have to look far to see systems that are based on the same infrastructure as the music industry. And music, of course, is so personal to everyone. You grew up with your favorite bands, favorite artists, and from the observation, your time, there was something that you would really like to see in the music industry, looking at it as an industry that's based so much on segregation. If we just look at even music, are still so based off, what might that be? And you don't even have to answer it specific to the industry, but
No,
that.
this the same thing just happened. You cut out right during the crucial part of the question again.
Oh, sorry. Yes. What would you like to see change in the music industry?
Um, yeah, that's well. I think, I mean, you referenced earlier. So there are still these kind of there's a residue of truly colonial practices that structure the industry in certain ways, and I think that questioning structures is a really important thing to do in this kind of work around race and racism. To not just accept as a given the way things are, but to try to understand better how they came to be, and
Mhm.
to understand where choices were made and where different choices might have been made, and where different choices might yet be made, or where interventions might actually make a difference. Because, I mean, that's part of, I think, it's natural. We're born into a world that is not of our own making, and so we tend to approach most of the world as if it's already made, and it's not. And it's being rebuilt and maintained in 1,000 big and small ways all the time. And I think with something like the music industry, if you just approach it as not as a given, but as a kind of organism that is still evolving and growing, and that can, it might be urged to behave in different ways or something like that. And I would say the same of a university as a structure. I mean, I think that refusing to just accept things as a given and to really question, like, how did this get this way? Why is this way? Who is it serving? Who
Yeah.
is this serving, and who's ill served by this, and how might that be different, and what might equity really look like in this setting, and those kinds of questions.
Yes.
But I think the world as we inherit it, makes that kind of thinking. I mean, it's not the easiest way to think. It's
No,
easier to not ask those kinds of questions.
definitely. And I even think about just the language I use. It's like, you say the game, right? The rules of the game. This is the way it is. This is the way. And you're right. It's like, it's the world that we inherited, but does it have to be that way? And is it even set up in the way. And and I always remind people, especially musical guests, that there is no industry without the artists. So once you
Right. Well, no, and this is the thing, and this is why, I mean, in some ways, this is why the inclusion language is so bankrupt, because at the end of the day, we're always talking about power, and we shouldn't forget that. You know, we shouldn't tell ourselves a kind of kumbaya story about how we're all, you know, we've all come together and we're all different and it's one great big smorgasbord of you know, human diversity, and isn't that great? And it is great, but all of this happened within very particular power relations, and we still live with those, and it's really important to get beyond the kind of platitudes about difference and diversity, and get to the real work of understanding power and how it's allocated and how it might be challenged.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, Matt, thank you so much for just being so generous with all of these ideas.
Oh, thank you.
Seriously though, like I'm thinking what I'm realizing how important the languages that we use to talk about these things, because you know, talking about equality has a really different outcome in people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
Desegregation versus inclusion, all of these things are so helpful for those of us who aren't in, you know, doing your course or doing this. Sometimes we don't have the tools and the right language to
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
power us in this conversation. So thank you for equipping us tonight. And yeah, I'm just really honored to have someone
My pleasure.
us. Yeah, it's wonderful.
The honor is mine. Thank you so much, and for the
Yes.
invitation. I'm delighted for the chance to talk with you.
All right, Matt. I'll let you go, but we'll be in touch. And thanks
Great,
again.
please. All right.
Okay. Bye
Good
bye.
night.